but I do hope you found it very, very interesting. I will hand over now to Jason's son to introduce the final panel session for this afternoon. Thank you.
Thank you, Virginia. So with the final session, as mentioned before, what we want to do is unpack sort of importance on all the existing people-to-people and business-to-business relationship, and really harness the innovation that will overcome the challenges, and then really using Australia as possibly a global hub for investment and international readiness. So with that, I'd like to welcome to the panel Mr. Michael Woods, CEO and Director of Newburyport Partners, and Mr. Thian Chu, Chairman and CEO of Invion Group, and Associate Professor Tam Nguyen, Deputy Director of Research, St. Vincent's Hospital, and Dr. Helena Chin, Head of the Cardiovascular Pharmacology Laboratory and the National Heart Foundation Future Fellow, Monash University. So welcome to the panel. Like the panel before, we would like to make a little bit more interactive. So Michael, I might start with you. The first question is brought to you. You obviously have extensive experience in capital markets and corporate investment across Asia, Australia, Asia, and Europe. And now your focus, my understanding, is in medtech. And how does the medtech landscape in Australia and China compare with its other market and each other? What are the opportunities?
Sure. Thanks, Jason, and thanks for the opportunity to be on this panel. I'd sort of summarize my observations really across several sort of aspects. One is the capital markets, but the other is the underlying dynamics from an investor perspective or an advisor to investors that I see around both the supporting as well as the headwinds that I see. And obviously in Australia, there's been a lot of research done over the last several years by LaunchVic and other government bodies that highlights a sort of a relatively smaller number of angel investors acting in Australia, which is a challenge for early stage companies. But I think we're seeing a really growing number of smaller venture capital or investor funds, government-backed funds, whether it's And Health or whether it's Horizon 3. Lots of additional funds are being established with a view to funding early stage companies. And in sort of, what Newburyport certainly found as well is there's a real appetite among wholesale investors and brokers for taking and understanding at a detailed level biotech risk and business development risks associated with it. And we've seen that, certainly the ASX has raised over $2.5 billion since March 2020 for life science companies. And that's a really significant amount of money, which has been raised through IPO and secondary placements over what's otherwise been a relatively challenging period. And I think those factors really play out, on the angels acting independently being sort of thin, but then the more informed investors really liking the sector. And we've heard as well from the Burnett and others about what a fantastic foundational research gets done in Australia and across almost all the fields of medicine and biotech. We have KOLs, key opinion leaders here in Australia. And being a small country, we also have those KOLs very well connected across the country with hospitals, and that means a more nimble clinical environment for getting new technology adopted. And we've heard about lots of state and federal government support for innovation, and I think one of the unappreciated benefits of Australia is that the close connections that a lot of us have with Asia and China in particular means there's a lot less fear around partnership with Chinese or other Asian countries than there is when I'm dealing with startups out of US or startups out of Europe who see it as any kind of partnership as a surefire way to lose their IP. And I think that's sort of partly driven by the fact that there's so many entrepreneurs and researchers in Australia that have heritage or family connections to Asia as well. But that said, I think we tend to be pretty isolated as well, and that creates significant headwinds. And COVID hasn't helped from a physical distancing perspective. But my personal impression is many researchers are somewhat more isolated from commercial partners and interests than in other countries. And we heard Anthony from Cochlear talk about their sort of great work partnering with researchers and others, but there aren't that many commercial organisations engaged in such a deep way as Cochlear are in that sense. We're also a small country with few competitors, and that tends to lead to a reduced level of, let's say, stress testing of business models and commercialisation strategy when it comes to entering into the global stage, and a lack of awareness about what else is going on around the world. But I think that, and that's sort of why I think angels who are a little bit more isolated here don't have the same confidence to invest. But sort of there's a great ecosystem of institutional investors that do, and advisors that do. And I think there's a huge opportunity for investment in those earlier stage projects to take them forward and create value through partnerships. And I think events such as this and the other event that you were speaking about, Jason, as well, in the reverse, essentially, are fantastic in accessing that more entrepreneurial spirit, accessing those relationships offshore, and really addressing those headwinds through bringing the right teams and the right alignments on board from an investor perspective and an advisor perspective. It's critical to have that depth and breadth of experience, not just in the foundational research, but across a broader, I guess, scope as you move closer to marketing and distribution.
Fantastic. Thank you, Michael, for your contribution. Michael obviously talked about from an investment perspective and described the ecosystem in terms of investment in Australia for early startup medtech companies, but also there is also room for improvement to bring Asian investors and Asian startups into the country. So talking about that, I'd like to go to Thian. Thian, obviously someone with a deep connection in both Australia and China. You run an ASX listed biotech company, have significant experience in both markets. What makes Australia such an attractive market for biotech, and how could this link to what happened to China?
Yeah, thanks, Jason, and thanks for having me. It's actually interesting. We could actually talk a little bit about our journey at Invion and how that relates to the Australia-China link. Just a bit of background, our technology is using something called photodynamic therapy in treating cancers. And so what a compound does is it selectively accumulates in cancer cells, but not healthy cells. And then when you shine a certain frequency of light, there's a oxidation process, you know about ROS generation, and that actually kills just those targeted cells and not the healthy tissue around it. So we think that's a very interesting modality that we're working on. And coming to the Australia-China link, actually the technology originated in Russia, moved to China when an investor and entrepreneur from the RMW Cho group actually started working and developing this technology. And a few years ago, in about 2017, we decided to actually take the next step and come to Australia to take and develop this compound into the next phase. And we really came to Australia for a few key reasons. The first one was Australia, and I'm a little biased because I grew up in Melbourne, and so did the chairman of RMW, Michael Cho. We ended up finding that there's incredible talent and expertise in Melbourne and Australia. So as a result, we've actually partnered up with the Hudson Institute of Medical Research, which is based out of Clayton. They've got nearly 500 researchers that are working with us and have been a real partner with us since we really started in 2017. And on top of that, we've been working with the Peter MacCallum Cancer Centre as well. And they're one of the worldwide premier institutions that really are very adept at actually bridging that gap between the research and actually the clinic. So the translational side, they've got both researchers and clinicians working together. And they're currently running about 500 clinical trials as we speak. So the talent and expertise was really one of the big drivers that brought us to Australia, and particularly Melbourne. The second reason was really the environment that Australia provides for, particularly for early stage biotech assets. Being able to combine the flexibility with the quality. So we talked about the quality, but the flexibility around getting early stage clinical trials into place, working with clinicians and ethics committees, and actually just getting rubber hitting the road. And to your earlier point about a launch pad, we felt that's a great foundation for us as we move to early stage clinical trials. It gives us this potential to sort of grow into other markets, other jurisdictions, with the confidence that the results we have in Australia are something we can stand by pretty well. And I guess the third reason we really wanted to come to Australia was financial. Firstly, it's significantly cheaper to conduct a lot of the work in Australia versus, say, the US. And on top of that, there are some great sort of government R&D incentives that are provided. So essentially, every dollar we spend actually can go a lot further. So that kind of that kind of brings us to the table of where we are today. And China is still a very interesting space to look at. One of the earlier speakers mentioned, Australia is a much smaller market. One of the challenges in terms of developing, for example, late stage clinical trials is lack of patient populations. And in China, you can figure out any indication, you got plenty of patients to work with. So, and the cost is relatively good as well. And on top of that, China's has really reformed a lot of its regulatory as well as a development of innovative new drug sort of initiatives. And so I think there's going to be a lot more connectivity between the two markets going forward.
Yeah, fantastic. Thanks for Thian for sharing your experience, and certainly that's what we, Virginia and I, developing this program, helping I guess Asian or Chinese companies to come to here, and then using Australia as a launchpad. Certainly, your experience is a testimony of that. So thank you, Thian. I might circle back to you later on. Now I'd like to go to Associate Professor Thian Nguyen. And Thian, you are someone who's very familiar with the Australian clinical trial space, and you have built a strong reputation in medical technology, both in Australia and elsewhere. So could you please share your experience in sort of a dynamic ecosystem in Australia, particularly in Victoria? What benefit do you see when an Asian or Chinese company wanting to invest or establish businesses here? I mean, Thian's already mentioned some of those, but if you can give a more sort of rounded picture given where you sit.
Sure, yeah. Thanks for the question and for the invitation to be on this panel discussion. And being the last one is always, if it's in real life, it's between us and the networking drinks, but probably us and dinner or something like that. But Thian already gone through with that really kind of illustrative case of how early stage company can really benefit, getting access to world-class medical facility here with really globally recognized key opinion leaders and PIs. But the actual other really benefit is actually in the regulatory pathway or the system that we have in place. So unlike the US, there's no IND requirement. It's only you need to get your study protocol reviewed by one ethics committee, and it covers for the rest of Australia. So both public-private sites, and of course the R&D takes, as Tim mentioned, and a few other speakers mentioned as well, where essentially you get a 43.5% back on every dollar you spend. So as a researcher, that's fantastic. Putting my investor hat on. Every dollar I put in, I leverage another at least, 30-something%. So you got to remember, you got to pay the R&D tax people as well. And setting up company and subsidiaries in Australia couldn't be easier. It's just so much easier, and the way of doing business and so on and so forth. It's very much easy for foreign company to set up. I mean, you don't need to have a presence. You can have your resident director actually, doing all that work for you. IP is something that we've been talking about. So there's strong IP protections, and plus with that recent introductions of the patent box, which is that extra concessional tax treatment to the profits that actually derive from that IP that you've got. So that's quite good. But, wearing my Victorian hat on, I mean, there's other aspects as well. I mean, we've got a pretty strong, healthy ecosystem in health and medical research. We have over 300 hospitals here, large and small. So 300 hospitals and health services in Victoria. But importantly, we run about 1/3 of clinical trials in Australia. So 1/3 of clinical trials activities in Australia happen in Victoria. And that's pretty massive. The other aspects is, and Helena can sort of talk more on this, but our Health and Medical Research Institute consistently receive between 40 to 45% of the national competitive funding. That's more than the next 3 states combined. So that's very impressive. And with the support from the federal government, through the Medical Research Future Fund, there's something like, $20 billion over the 10-year period. And recently there are a number of funds locally as well, namely the Breakthrough Victoria Fund, which is a $2 billion fund over the next 10 years. And health and life sciences are one of the key pillars. So to support that early stage research. On top of that, we've got local funding, Michael already mentioned some of that, but to add to that is BioCurate, which is a fund between the state government, Melbourne University, Monash University, our really top 2-3 university in Australia. And recently, Brandon Capital, one of the big venture fund, actually received $40 million to actually set up this biotech incubator. So a lot of opportunities, just to sum it up, really, we've got a strong ecosystem from both talents, funding, but also pathway to actually get up to the next stage. And again, as I mentioned, we're looking forward to getting questions from the audience, but also the panelists' interaction as well.
Great, thanks for Tam. I think you mentioned Helena as well. So with that, I'd like to introduce Helena Chin, Dr. Helena Chin. For someone who's so young, already have so much experience in both Australia and China in the medical research space. So Helena, I'd just like to ask you, from your, reflecting on your experience in both the medical research and innovation sector in Australia and China, from your perspective, what are the differences between those ecosystems, and how can they work together post-COVID, to post-COVID recovery to enhance ecosystem in both countries?
Well, thank you, Jason. And thank you very much for the invitation. It's my great pleasure to be on the panel and to be with lots of excellent panelists to discuss this really important question. So I'm a scientist and also entrepreneur. I've experienced 2 ecosystems in the past few years. So share some of my my limited experience with these 2. There are complementary things between the 2 ecosystem. There's also a lot of similarities. So if I start with similarity, I think for a startup company or someone starting up a scientific lab, it's actually very similar. You need to articulate value proposition with differentiation, so with your technology. Secondly, you need to have a really good team. So that's regardless of what ecosystem I think you're in. In terms of differences, so if you start from the China side, as Brett actually mentioned earlier, China has a lot of scientific science parks or industry parks. So those parks are a really good starting point for a lot of startups. And there's access to infrastructure. A lot of the rentals are pretty much free. And then there's access for funding as well. And normally there's a few different streams. You can go in as a talent, so people support, or you can go in as a project support. So depending on which one you are more competitive with, so there's a few different things you can go with. So this is in the in terms of the funding side. The other important part is the we all talk about government incentives. Australia have R&D incentive, which is really, really great. In China, it doesn't have the R&D incentive. However, it does have incentive when you pay tax. If you're a high-tech company, but you need to qualify as a high-tech company. So you need to be able to spend at least 5% of your revenue on high-tech, and then you're qualified at this, and then you can have a reduction for tax. The other really interesting thing I learned from my industry partner the other day is they were using their patent as their asset to borrow money from the bank. So I think that's a really interesting strategy as well. So in the past, we always think, patent IP is not as important in China, but I think it's changing the landscape. So with the patent box in Australia, I think a lot of good incentive come through as well. So I think this is good alignment between two countries as well. The regulatory pathway in China for medical technology, they actually have tiers. So federal government is more for class 3 medical devices, but the recent reform is class 1, and class 2. So the two kind of the simple version of the medtech categories could be approved by the preferential level. So it's a fast-tracked level as well, because we know CFDA is really, really slow because they have a lot of cases to deal with. So, but in Australia, I think that's all together. So that's the other differences as well. So when you think about the strategy, do you want to go to category 3 or do you want to go to category 2 and 1 first while you're launching your category 3 as CFDA? So that's the other, I guess, the other thing to think about. The governance is also a bit different between the two countries. In Australia, as Tim mentioned, and we are very proud with our infrastructure in medical institute in Australia, and particularly in Victoria, in Melbourne. We have the excellent Parkville precinct, and in lots of really good medical institutes as well. I'm repped, so that's where Burnett an institute is embedded in. There's also Clayton site as well. So there's a lot of really good medical institutes with and university with specialized, I guess, strengths. Peter Mac is cancer, Burnett is diagnostics and infectious disease. Where I'm sitting is at the Parkville Monash site. So we do a lot of drug discovery and development. So each institute have their own strengths and own differentiation, but there's actually a lot of collaboration between us as well. So it's a very small and cohesive group to work with. So I think that's the other strengths that we have here. When international collaborators come to us, it's easier to identify who are the leaders and who you can tap in based on the leaders. But I have to say, I think we could do better with industry engagement. We are geographically isolated. We don't have a lot of big pharma companies apart from CSL. So I think if there's, when we had our spell tech, there's a lot of inbound pharma companies comes here, but that's only kind of once a year, twice a year. Those relationships has not really, I think, developed as much as we wished. So that's hopefully something we could do in the future to actually also engage more with Asia as well. Because instead of just looking at US and Europe, actually Asia and China is also a lot of pharma companies are actually looking at technologies and research here. I think Tesla a few years ago had a big agreement with Mesoblast. So that's a pretty good example of things could happen between a biotech and really big pharma company. And they also works closely with research institutes. And as what Thian has mentioned, there's also a really good, your company has in-depth collaboration with Hudson Institute as well. So I think that's all excellent examples of how this industry and academia could work together. So I think I'll open that to the rest of the panel.
Okay, thank you, Helena. I again like to encourage questions from the audience. While I'm waiting for that, I'm aware Michael has a question for Thian. So Michael.
Hi, Thian. One thing I often hear said is that Australian companies list too early and too early stage without enough product validation, and then end up zombie companies on the ASX, and and they sort of trade poorly and fail to really have enough news flow or access to re-rating events that are going to translate into higher share prices. And I've tended to disagree with that, because listing provides liquidity and allows investors to choose the stage of a company's commercialization process that they're prepared to take the risk on. I just wondered if you had any thoughts on, as the chair of a company that's pre-revenue and going through its commercialization process, whether you had any thoughts around the sort of that resistance from some commentators to early stage listing of companies on the ASX.
Yeah, thanks, Michael. That's a great question. As with everything, there's always kind of two sides to the equation, and I definitely can see the perspective of why you don't want to list too early. One of them is it's a lot of extra overhead for a young company or small company to be sort of being in listed status, and Australia has a good sort of reputation and environment for corporate governance, for example. A lot of ramifications on the back of it. That creates overhead, and for many early stage companies, it might be a bit too early. In fact, you talked about liquidity, and liquidity takes time to build, and especially pre-revenue. Everyone's just measuring you based on the science, and not everyone in the market really is familiar with the science or the sort of the commercialization pathway. So that is one thing which I think has merit. I think it's really more around the overhead required that really burdens an early stage company. The flip side, though, is I think there are good reasons to be listed at an earlier stage. And a lot of people, if you're trying to approach VCs or private venture capital companies and early stage investors, unless you're lucky and you get some sort of angel that just likes you as a person and your idea, just throws some money at you, many institutional early stage investors tend to watch you and tend to just track you and say, yeah, great to meet you. Let's see how it goes for the next 6 months, 12 months, 18 months. And instead of you going, around the merry-go-round, talking to all the same guys for the next 2 years, listing can be a faster, more efficient way to do it. And in fact, that's one of the drivers for us. For our cancer program, we actually are fully funded by our partner, RMW Cho Group. So we don't have immediate funding, at least from the cancer side of things. But one of the objectives of being listed was to get our story out there, and for people to hear our story and get comfort that what we're saying is actually, is actually legitimate, and that has helped us reduce, frankly, the amount of outbound effort that's required to really just say, hey, this is what we do. Hey, let's sign NDA. Hey, let's keep going. And so for us, it's been actually a very good thing. And by the time we're closing a placement, hopefully in the next few weeks, we can actually start building that sort of story with the market. So it's not kind of a one and done where we come in and then we raise a bunch of money and then we go home. It's much more of a journey where we basically start small, we get everyone comfortable, raise a little bit, potentially raise a little bit more then. And so that I think generally just gives the market a little bit more confidence, and then we can grow up with the market and our developments.
Absolutely. I like to say to people, the listing process is hard, but so is keeping 4 VCs and institutional investors due diligence process going, and you're going to have to do that every 18 months if you're not listed, as opposed to once if you are. So there's certainly a benefit from a time required to invest in the actual transaction process as well. Thanks for that.
Right. Thanks, Thian, and thanks, Michael. So I'd like to take some questions. There's a couple of questions coming from an anonymous attendee. So I might throw it to you, Thian, because these are related to clinical trials. So the first question is relating to the roles of how's the role of Australian CRO company in bringing in global clinical trials to Australia?
Actually, a lot. And before I forget, just a quick point on Helena mentioning about, having your IP and borrowing from, money from the bank from company perspective, but also from the researcher's perspective as well. It's a bit like debt funding for your startups, and we might come back to that because that's quite interesting. We don't see a lot of that in Australia. But in terms of the roles of CROs actually bringing global trials to Australia, it's actually a lot. We do a lot of early phase clinical trials with all the reasons that we mentioned, whether it's rapid approval, single IRB or ethics committee, and they're under tax incentive as well. But I think the next question would be actually, can we expand a bit further in actually not only doing early phase trial, but actually doing a late phase trial a lot more than that. So Zach put in the chat there, the link to the latest NTP Connect clinical trials report, outlining where we are in terms of trials. So we basically represent about 5% of the global trials number in terms of the volume. We could do a lot more, but remember we only have about 26 million people here. But I think we can do a lot more in terms of actually continue on, not only in early phase trial, but bring it back to actually do late phase. And a few things to do with that actually, in terms of the support locally for, I guess, one of the things that sort of really on my mind recently is that, why do we, for late phase trials, a lot of samples, a lot of analysis, and need to go back to central labs, whether it's in Singapore or US. Why couldn't we do it here? And so, there's a lot of capabilities of lab services here in Australia, although at the moment they'd probably be busy with the COVID testing and so on and so forth. But in terms of trials, there are, sort of really key leaders in the field and happen to be in Melbourne as well. So you might have seen the big acquisitions by an overseas company that bought out 360 Biolabs for a massive sum recently. That was the acquisition was done recently, and so there are sort of key players to actually support that. In terms of selling our capability, but don't forget the fact that it's the CROs, but also the support from our state and federal government as well. Through Austrade, through all the Victorian global, or the global VIC, various offices in China and the rest of the world. And we as researchers and as site, we have to do our bits as well. So it comes back to that, working in collaborations.
Just follow up on that. So the same person's asked for regulatory requirement. Some countries, a lot of countries only accept clinical trials from their jurisdiction or from their country. Mm-hmm. So how is Australia overcoming that? I mean, what are the jurisdictions accept Australia trials and so how does that?
Well, so typically, and you mentioned in your sort of opening remarks as well, that our data is widely accepted by the FDA, EMA, and so on and so forth. If there are, so let's say a trials require local data, let's say part of Asia, for example, the bulk of the work is because we've got a fairly diverse patient population. Right, so it's the bulk of the data that we achieve. And let's say you go to US, if they want local data because of their ethnic minorities are different from our sort of culturally and linguistically diverse patient population, so they can do that. But I think coming back to that earlier questions about bringing trials in that early phase, it's that late phase that actually helping to drive the ecosystem further, because otherwise, there was a mention of Telix before, trials running here, but if they go to Belgium, they probably require some local data, for example, or in the US. So that's, in a way, you do need it, and it's not a big hurdles anyway, and it's been sort of run quite well, and it's a well-oiled machine.
Yeah. So what you're saying, Tam, is a supplementary trial that needs to be done. The main trial could be done in Australia with multi-ethnic population and also streamlined approval, a government R&D incentive, reimbursement. So all that sort of things make Australia a good position to do trials quickly and cost effectively. Some jurisdictions have different population group, thus require you to do a supplementary trial, but that's not your pivotal study. The pivotal study could be done in Australia, but with a supplementary data. So Helena, I think you raised another question. I think Thian and Michael might be able to answer that. And Helena wants to ask a question. Maybe you ask yourself, actually.
Sure. Hi. I just thought to pick your guys' brain on like how is listing biotech in Australia versus Hong Kong, Shanghai, Singapore, like the pros and the cons between.
You probably need to add to that, the US with the NASDAQ as well, because in
Yes.
my experience, and I have a little bit less in Shanghai and Singapore, so maybe we can get Tan's input on that. But the listing, the observation I have is listing requirements are different. So what substance your business has to be listed is different for different exchanges. In Australia, it's relatively easy because one of the requirements is net assets of $5 million or more. And as long as you're raising more than $5 million, you'll meet that requirement post-listing. So it's a pretty simple bar to get over. Other markets require different, listing requirements in terms of the substance of the business. But I think the more important factor in making a decision on this is what the investor appetite on a particular exchange is for a particular asset class. So, we at Newburyport were advising a company during 2019 and 20 on listing in the ASX, and at the end of the day, they chose, against our advice, I might add, to list on the NASDAQ on the basis that they thought that the US market would value their company highly, and in fact it didn't. The final result from is that they listed, they traded down, and the market cap now is probably lower than we were going to target for a listing over here. So it's the nature of that particular story around medical devices that were sort of relatively early stage and gearing up for clinical trial appeals more in an Australian market than it ultimately did for the NASDAQ. So I think maybe Tan can talk a little bit about some of the other markets, but it's about finding the advisors that'll be honest with you about what your prospects are. And there's a good reason that a lot of companies that are from offshore raise funds off the ASX at earlier stages in their development that may have no nexus, particularly with Australia.
Yeah, but perhaps I could add to what Michael said, Helena. I think the whole process of listing has two sides of the coin. One side is just getting listed, and getting listed is actually not the end of the journey, it's just the start of the journey. And so if you take that mindset, then to Michael's point, you can start thinking from a longer term strategic perspective. I think the other aspect to listing is the natural investors in the market itself and how familiar they are with biotech. So if we take some of the jurisdictions you mentioned, say in Australia, Australia's got a relatively long history of having early stage biotechs listed. It doesn't have, apart from CSL, doesn't seem to have as much of a history of sort of the large pharma sort of big person sort of development. But certainly from an earlier stage, there is at least some market participation, although I think there probably can be a greater depth when you start talking about getting up the food chain in terms of expertise. There's a lot of retail investors. If you start getting to more family office and institutions, then Australia probably can sort of grow in that area. Now, in terms of, say, in China, China tends to be more domestically oriented, and the exchanges, obviously there's a huge amount of activity there already, but it tends to be focused more on the domestic market, and that's who the participants are as well. Hong Kong is kind of something in between. They introduced a Chapter 18A, which is essentially a regulatory framework specifically designed for healthcare biotech companies. And there's actually Hong Kong is the #2 biotech market for capital raising in the world after NASDAQ itself, and has had tremendous sort of success there. There's a lot of backing by the government as well. The downside, I guess, on Hong Kong is still the catching up from the general market. I'm not talking about specific healthcare focused funds or investors, but just generally people there are focused on cash flow, real estate, what's the PE multiple, and that just doesn't quite work with biotech. I think Singapore may be in a similar situation. I'm actually less familiar with Singapore, but it could well be a little bit more similar to, say, Hong Kong. And also, obviously, NASDAQ is the big historic one. Obviously, it's going to be much more sophisticated from the investor base, but it is US centric generally. Australia, China is kind of another planet sometimes to some of the investors, and yet this part of the world has one of the largest sources of innovation, I think, going forward.
Great. I'm sensing, in our audience, some people are growing a bit weary. We're dropping off your audience. So I think it's almost drawing to a conclusion. But before we finish the panel, I'd like to have one last hurrah. So now, as you know, Virginia and I are building a program and with some of the people in the audience as well, some of the people on the panel, building a program to enrich the Australian and Victorian medical innovation ecosystem by attracting Asian and Chinese medical technology company to set up a global strategy in Australia, using Australia as a launchpad to develop that. So again, I like to go to Thian because you are someone who has gone through that journey, right? You've gone through that journey. So in many ways, you can be the testimonial for that process. If you have 1 minute to give your pitch to a group of Chinese or Asian medtech entrepreneurs, innovators, to attract them to Australia or Victoria to set up business like you, what would you say? Your minute, start now.
Okay, firstly, it's you've got good resources and good expertise. Secondly, you can accelerate your development very quickly because those early stage trials have a lot less overhead than, say, an IND. And thirdly, every dollar lasts a lot longer. You get it's cheaper, generally faster if you can work with the right parties, and the government gives you that 43.5 cents. So that's my pitch.
Fantastic, excellent. Thank you very much for our panelists. Really grateful for your insight. With that, I'd like to pass the stage back to Virginia. Thank you, Virginia.
Oh, wow. Thank you so much. That was fascinating. So huge thanks to Jason, Helena, Michael, Tan, and Tam as well. In closing, I'd just like to reinforce the underlying messages of today's summit. Australia remains open for business and committed to the bilateral business relationship with China, our #1 trading partner. Building and maintaining relationships is vital. Finding the right partner on the ground is essential. Learning from those who've already entered into business in and with China is worthwhile in saving you time, money and angst. ACBC, with our strong network of engaged businesses, sits at the forefront of the trade relationship, and we remain committed to assisting businesses on both sides to find mutually beneficial pathways to success. So please connect with us, join our vibrant networks around Australia, and support our work in advocacy and knowledge sharing by becoming an ACBC member. I acknowledged at the start of today's session that this summit could not have happened without our event partners, the National Foundation for Australia-China Relations, Global Victoria, and Invion, the ASX listed company leading the global clinical development of a novel photodynamic therapy for cancer. Our sincere thanks to each of you for your support. To each of our outstanding speakers, our sincere thanks to you for so willingly sharing your time and expertise with us today. Our thanks also to our small dedicated ACBC team, Zach and Alex, and our interns for all your hard work behind the scenes today and in the months leading up to this successful summit. And finally, I thank you, our guests, for joining today's virtual summit. Follow-up communication will be sent to you over the coming days, so please check your junk mailbox in case it arrives in there. And in the meantime, stay safe and well, and we look forward to seeing you all again soon. Good afternoon. Take care. Thank you.
Thank you, Virginia. A welcome
Thanks,
drinks
Virginia.
will be served.
Yes.
Will be served very soon.